In this clip you will learn how to debug with the help of Copilot. We wrote some pretty good prompts in the previous clip, so our code is already quite okay. But as I've just shown you with the AI hallucination sample, that won't always be the case. Mistakes will happen and you will have to debug your code base or fix warnings and errors. Here too, Copilot can be of help. First things first, there's already a lot that we can do before effectively starting a debugging session. There's a few warnings in our code base at the moment. One of them on get order line by ID async from the order line repository, which we got with the help of Copilot. If I hover over this, I see that it's a possible null reference return issue that's causing this warning squiggle here. But if I click on the light bulb, I find an Analyze with Copilot button. Let's give that a try. It seems like Copilot found multiple issues, both problems it says. One, the return type of getOrderLine by ID async doesn't seem to match the interface signature. It can solve that by adding the question mark here. The second problem to fix is actually very much related to that, and it can be fixed in the same way, by telling the compiler that order line can potentially be null. So let's preview the fix. And the only thing that's going to happen here is that the question mark will be added. I'm not going to accept this now because I want to show you another way to fix this. From right inside the error list. Here you see issues, warnings, and a few messages in my case. What we can do straight from the error list is ask Copilot for a bit of help with that. So let's ask it to help with that return type. Copilot chat is automatically opened. If you have an active thread, it will use that one, so it has additional context. And you can see that Copilot analyzed the error, detailed what the error was, and how to fix it. It actually suggests the exact same fix as inline. So I'm going to preview it again. We see that the change will be the addition of the question mark here. Let's accept it. And there we go, our error is gone. So that is one way Copilot can help you with fixing your code even before starting a debugging session. But now let's start a debugging session. Let's say I'm going to put a breakpoint on our create order with order lines unit of work. There's this method here, create order with order lines async. Let's put a breakpoint there and see how Copilot can help us while debugging. Let me send a request that will end up in us hitting this breakpoint. A request to create a new order with order lines should do the trick. And we hit our breakpoint. If you have a look at the locals window here, we see that order lines has one item. Maybe we can ask Copilot why that's the case. So where is this item coming from? Where is this order line actually coming from? So I'm just going to open the Ask Copilot inline chat experience here. And I'm going to ask, why is there one item in the order lines variable? What we get is a bit of explanation about the create order with order lines async method. But the only thing Copilot at this moment can really tell me is that there's only one item in the order lines variable because, well, only one order line is passed in when calling this method. That's not exactly what I wanted to know. I wanted to know where that order line is coming from. Let me try this again. So I'm going to repeat this question. And if we press the hashtag symbol here, we see that this time we can reference more things than just files or the solution. It seems that we can now reference the full call stack or reference the local variable names. Referencing the full call stack should give me a bit more info. And there we go. This time the call stack was inspected, so Copilot was able to tell me where exactly that order line is coming from the create order async method in the orders handlers class. So that's already a lot more useful. So as you can see, what can be referred to via hashtag changes depending on what you're doing. Sometimes you'll be able to reference a selection of code. Sometimes you'll be able to add a reference to an active window, to the call stack, to the locals, and so on. Feel free to experiment with this. From here you can then continue asking questions. In fact, Copilot is already suggesting some questions that may be useful, like how can I ensure that multiple order lines are passed to the create order async method? Let's click it. And there we go. It tells me how to provide multiple order lines when calling this. Stuff like this can definitely be useful while figuring out why and how to write certain tests. And like that, your debugging session can become a code fix session. But all of this is under the assumption that we know where a mistake might happen, or that we know what to inspect, because we set our breakpoints somewhere where we thought it would be useful. But breakpoints aren't necessarily always useful. It's quite common to make them conditional. Well, Copilot can actually suggest improvements to your breakpoints as well. It's an option you have to enable though. So, open the settings here and make sure that Enable AI Suggestions for Breakpoint Expressions is checked. That's already the case on my machine. And let's see where I can add a few more breakpoints so we can configure them. Let me add a few in the order lines handlers. And now if I right-click the breakpoint, I can configure it. Let's go to the conditions here. Say that I only want to enable this breakpoint if a certain condition is met. By clicking in the expression field here, you will see that Copilot is going to suggest things. So that went pretty fast, but let me do that again so you can definitely see it. Down below here, you see that Copilot has been asked for suggestions, and Copilot suggests to only enable this breakpoint if the order ID is larger than 1000. Something likewise is true for the actions. Here too, Copilot can suggest certain things. For example, when the action is show a message in the output window, Copilot can suggest which message would make sense to show. So there we go. That's how Copilot can help you with fixing your warnings, errors and messages, and with debugging. The first thing that happens before you start a debugging session is often that somewhere in your codebase an exception happened. In fact, we can easily trigger one. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at the code base in detail, but one of the things that are missing is input validation. The DTOs for creating an order line or creating an order with order lines do have validation attributes applied, but seeing I'm using a minimal API approach, these are not automatically checked. You have to manually do that one way or another. So I can easily trigger an exception by sending a request that is invalid. So that will result in an update exception on the database. Let's say I'm going to send a post request to create an order. I'm going to accept JSON, and I'm also going to send JSON. And what I'm going to send is a title field with null as value. This will definitely fail. If we have a look at the order DTO here, that's this one, we see that title is a required field. Let's send that request. And there we go. I hit a DB update exception. That makes sense, obviously, because we're trying to add a row without a title, and that is not possible. The title field is required in our database as well. The reason we hit this DB update exception is because the input is not validated. Here too, the Ask Copilot button is visible. Let's see what Copilot advises us to do. It figured out what's wrong and attempt to insert a null value in a non-nullable column. It states that this might be because the order might not have a title value set. That also makes sense. And it also states that it could be a mapping problem or a problem with the title property not being included in the DTO at all. It also states that if the property is required, that we should ensure that the application logic includes validation. And that's exactly what we already figured out, right? So let's ask Copilot how I can do that, how I can validate these properties. It gives me quite a few options. Data annotations on the entity classes. That might work. A Fluent API for validation. Manual validation in the business logic, or using a validation library. That would work for validation of the entity classes. And while that is a good idea, it's also a good idea to have some validation earlier in the call stack. In this case, I would like to see some validation at the level of what's coming in. So let's ask Copilot. So I'm going to ask it how I can validate the incoming DTO, and I'm going to tell it, so I'm going to be specific about what I want. I'm going to tell it that I'm using the minimal API approach. And let's have a look. It states that we can use data annotations. They are already in place. And this is the part where it becomes interesting. Thanks to the fact that I told it that we are using the minimal API approach, it actually suggests validating the incoming DTO inside of the handler, because validation of the incoming DTO isn't something that's automatically done in the minimal API approach. So this does actually make sense. Now, I'm not going to change this code here again, but you do see how we started from the DB update exception and eventually got to different ways of solving that. But how would our overall error handling be? Well, if we look in the program.cs file, I don't see much exception handling middleware here anywhere. And I would expect to at least see some sort of catch-all for exceptions that we cannot handle at other places in our code. So maybe this code base is missing something. Let's ask GitHub Copilot. I'm simply going to ask it to advise better overall error handling patterns for this solution. Let's see what gives. And this is actually one of the things I kind of like about Copilot. My question was pretty generic, right? I just asked it for better error handling inside of the complete solution. So it isn't very specific in what it suggests, but it does suggest a bunch of things that serve as inspiration or can serve as inspiration for improving our code base. One here is global exception handling that is indeed missing. We should do that. It also suggests validation error handling. We kind of got that more or less. It also suggests to maybe work with domain-specific exceptions, to use the problem details RFC for API errors. It advises to implement additional logging. It advises to use error handling for Entity Framework Core and even client-side error handling, which we have no use for in our API. So even though what is stated here isn't very specific, it does lead me to think about what we're doing with exception handling in our solution. One of the things I get from this is that I do need some sort of global error handling. Luckily, I kind of know how to do that. There's a few ways. A typical thing to do is when you're in a development environment to add the developer exception page middleware here, which will show a user-friendly exception page with the call stack. It's very useful during development. And when we're not in a development environment, I don't want to see this added. Instead, I want to use the regular exception handler middleware. That will ensure that the exception is logged and that the call stack is not shown to the end user. So this is a nice case of Copilot serving as something that inspires rather than something that comes up with a complete solution. Great. With that, you're ready. So you commit your code and you let your project lead know so she can review it. On to the next clip.